Thank you very much for coming here today. It's really nice to see a number of familiar faces, people that I've taught over the years, and someone really special, my high school art teacher, who was responsible for this. Thank you. And I worked in, as Louise was indicating, I've taught at Sydney College of the Arts, College of Fine Arts, and National Art School before I moved to New York to take a position at Parsons. And so I can't help myself, I haven't prepared the paper. I can talk really easily about other people's work, but it comes to my own, I need to refer to my notes. It just recently gave a paper last week at a conference in New York called The Photographic Universe. And I had the great pleasure of being on a panel with Michael T. Jones, who is the head engineer for Google Imaging and is responsible for the breach of your privacy as the Google Eye makes its way around the world. So it was a really interesting conversation. So this in part comes from that talk. And it's called The Universe in Return. I'm quoting from myself here. Light falls, moving over objects with a heavy tongue, tracing, imprinting, blind, staining the paper, a transient state, dark and indistinct, a small breath, a repose. Photography has been in revolution ever since its inception. Even before the idea of it was a radical departure from the way we see ourselves. What I'm going to do is kind of ground my interest in photography, the general kind of concerns that I'm interested in, which then leads into the work that we have here. And if I could show you an image right now, the image I would love to show you is the image made by NASA. And it was made by the curator of the Hubble telescope. And the curator of the Hubble telescope gets 3 days a year on the telescope, and all the other like rock star astrophysicists get half a day. And they have to compete to get that half a day. And so he did something really radical. He pointed a photographic plate via the Hubble telescope into the darkest point of space and exposed it for 3 days. Now this was scandalous at the time because people felt it was a waste of incredibly valuable time on the Hubble telescope. But after 3 days, that plate had arrested light. And what if you subscribe to those particular kind of theories, what it had arrested was the first light, the oldest light that we know. And so you have this beautiful conundrum, you have this plate where light fell on and arrested that image. But that thing no longer exists because it was however many billions of light years ago. So it's just light traveling across space, arrested at that moment of time. And there's something incredibly poetic and beautiful in that, which I find very arresting. So if I could show you an image, that's what I'm showing you right now. So even in the most remote, darkest corner of our universe, there is still light. It existed and it exists simultaneously. To write and to speak about things which simultaneously exist and do not creates a conundrum, and of course this is not a new problem for artists to deal with. It remains true that the process of creative work is difficult to describe. The narrative or the words that have been used to articulate the process are not necessarily apparent during the slow process of development and production. Ideas and influences become more or less focused. The work shifts, gestates, lies dormant, develops, regresses, transforms. There is no clear path, no line, no end. Instead, a process of constant consideration, reconsideration, rethinking and attempting, analysis, trial, error, and occlusion. And I want to read you a really beautiful quote here from one of my favorite writers, Jenna Frame. Blind I am safe. It is not the darkness resulting only from the withdrawal of light. It is the primary darkness, the first layer, the first condition of light, its foundation, its darkness which gives birth to a light that does not suffer the stain of human vision, a pure light resting, like a bandage, close to the deepest wound of the dark. The purpose of my work has been to develop a contemporary understanding of and a visual response to the photographic in relation to the sublime, excess and immateriality. I consider knowledge and certainty as expressed in historic and contemporary meanings of the photographic as a counterpoint to my work. I'm kind of obsessed to explore the slippage in visual certainty of the photographic image. One of the central concerns of my visual investigation is with this historical paradox. Knowledge, and in particular empirical knowledge, aims for certainty and fact, and yet the more knowledge that is gained, the greater the unknown becomes. The further you see, the further you see. I'm exploring how the escalation of knowledge produces uncertainty and fragmentation. I consider different modes of visual knowledge, and then how notions of the image, perception and illusion can create a vocabulary for representing the not known. The work that Louisa was showing in the catalogue there from ever, which is at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, came about as a result of being out in the desert. The landscape of Australia has been of great interest to me for probably about 10 years in my work. And so when I was out in the desert, I was in a very extraordinary period of time. It flooded, and consequently we became stranded out in the desert. And I became very aware of the slippage of gravity between the sky and the land, and losing the sensation of the weight of the earth. And so I was thinking about how do I make images which express that, which are not about this exists in front of the eye, but this exists within you and your response to land and place. And so this work was a response to that. I was also reading a really beautiful book by Jonathan Prairie called Techniques of the Observer. And in that book he describes the 18th century empirical scientists who, at a moment where God is replaced by light, stared into the sun because they believed that the sun with pure light would give them pure knowledge, and they would gain perfect knowledge. And so there's this wonderful account in the book where they stare into the sun and they close their eyes and they describe the after image to their assistants, who then draw the after images. But of course what they were doing was actually burning out their eyes. And according to this account, the last colour that you see is blue. And so consequently these images became blue because they were, kind of playing with the paradox of you look into the light to gain knowledge and you end up losing sight and become blind as a result of it. So it's very interesting, that paradox. And it's also kind of linked to the Indigenous history, which I'll come to in just a moment. So I consciously choose to use various photographic approaches in the visual exploration and research of my work. And this is due to the slippage between the real as perceived and the representational power of the photographic image and its evasive status. Photographs are of something. They have an analogous relationship to reality, with indexicality commonly seen as a condition of the medium. To make visible a laggard oscillation between the recognizable and the abstract, to create a tension between the assumed physical presence of the observer and the presumptions of the perception of the medium. It's a deep impulse to seek out material meaning in the photographic image. The photograph is the tension created by our desire for meaning, a material connection between the image and the lived reality of the experiential world. And when I think back, and I pause to reflect on this because next Tuesday I'm talking to a young artist who's in Art Express, who will talk to me about my work and vice versa. I had my high school teacher here. These were questions that came to me, when I was thinking back as early as year 7, like that the photograph is of something and yet it isn't, and I recall having these discussions throughout high school. So, eye storm, intensity and extensity. A photograph is an event transformed into an object, rather than being a record of things as we often suppose. It is the fixing of light and space over time. Historically, we've learned to read the photographic image in a certain way as implied in the above quotes, subconsciously privileging certain characteristics of the medium in line with social, cultural, and historical expectations. Photographic images, however abstract, are primarily understood as a record of the material world, and consequently a particular kind of material understanding is expected to be derived from the photographic. Historically, the photographic image was seen as one of purity, as nature reflecting her true face. Underlining this belief that a photographic's purity was derived from a perceived non-intention of the human hand and its pure derivation of light, light being pure. And William Irvins, who was the curator prince of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York from 1916 to 46, continues this line of reasoning. He argues that the photograph has no syntax, and he talks about a print or a painting having the syntax or the mark of the human hand. And so when you see a silkscreen print or an etching, you can see the lines and you can see the syntax or the language of the medium. And he made the argument that photography didn't have a syntax. Of course it does. It has a syntax through grain and through the choice of film and all the digital files that you use. But he argued that it had no syntax and therefore it was not made by the human hand. He called it a stain, and he said that he believed that the photographic process was free of the stain of the human hand. Roland Barthes describes the photograph in his essay, Rhetoric of the Image, as a perverse informant of denotation and connotation, a system of meaning torn internally between culture and nature. And I quote from him, "The type of consciousness the photograph involves is truly unprecedented, since it establishes not a consciousness of the being there of the thing which any copy can provoke, but an awareness of it having been there. What we have is a new space-time category, spatial immediacy and temporal anteriority. The the photograph being in a logical conjunction between the here now and the then here. He is describing photographic image as appearance as disappearance, absence within presence, blindness and knowledge. The reality offered by the photographic image is not truth to appearance, but truth to presence. Proof of something's existence in space and time rather than its resemblance. Jeffrey Batchen extends the theoretical lineage of these ideas, and Jeffrey Batchen is an Australian who's been working in America for quite some time and published quite a bit and is now in New Zealand. He proposes that the photograph can still lay claim to some sort of objectification, as opposed to digital photography, which he describes as being made by the human hand, interestingly. We can at least be sure that he or she was once there in front of the camera, and I'm quoting from Batchen. We can be sure that they were there at some point present in time and space. For what makes photographs distinctive is that they depend on this original presence, a referent in the material world that at some time really did exist to imprint itself on a sheet of light-sensitive paper. Reality may have been transcribed, manipulated, or enhanced, but photography doesn't cast doubt on reality's actual existence. What is being supported here and in earlier theories is a very particular understanding of photography. And I quote again, photography's plausibility has long rested on the uniqueness of its indexical relation to the world it imagines. Its relation regarded as fundamental to its operation as a system of representation. As a footprint is to a foot, so is a photograph to its reference. It is as if objects have reached down and touched the surface of the photograph, leaving their own traces, as faithful to the contour of the original object as a death mask is to the face of the newly departed. It is a trope that a photograph has reference to the real when it is assumed that a photograph can be of something that existed, and therefore the resemblance of, or is something that existed. How do we address a photographic image that is not dependent on this it existed? This slippage between our desire to see this existed in a photographic image and the abstract is what I'm interested in my own work. Ever is an investigation of the photographic in relation to the sublime, to excess, to immateriality, and the perceptual uncertainty of the photograph. The ever images mark small events as potential acts of immensity. I'm quoting from Barbara, who wrote the essay here. The images play with the ambiguity of appearances and utilize the contradiction between objective and subjective vision to explore the poetic dimension of photography. Proximity and distance collapse and conjure a more mythical and spiritual relationship with the landscape and forces of nature. Crystalline, elemental cloudscapes and roches and fishes in the land form cryptic images that are real shots, that are abstract in appearance and idea. What particularly interested me with these series here is that they came from transient landscapes. When I moved to America, I shifted landscape radically, and it took me a long time before I could make work which had any real meaning to me. What I became attracted to, for kind of similar reasons that I was interested in the Australian landscape, is that wonderful moment in winter when the snow comes and the ice comes, and you wake up one morning and suddenly the whole landscape around you is transformed. And for me, living in the middle of Manhattan and finding Broadway thigh deep in snow was quite some experience. And so you have this landscape which exists for a week or 2 weeks, and then it disappears, and then it comes back several weeks later. And I was very interested in this kind of uncertainty of the landscape. Of course, the theory that the thing in the photographic image existed provides the essential counterpoint to my visual work. My work relies on this dominant understanding of photography. I respond to the history of perception that has informed our vision. And Graham Wood writes poetically this conundrum. This is a beautiful quote from his book, Tycho's Nova. The ether, the basic substance of the universe. What's the difference between that old alchemy and the modern idea that 90% of the universe's matter is invisible, unknown, dark matter? What's the difference between any idea? The scientist replies, like the suggestion that everything and every being in the universe depends on every other thing, and every other being for its existence. Every particle is made up of all others. And so finally I want to talk momentarily about digital, because this is also the first work of mine that kind of used digital imaging. The space of knowledge and the space of perception merging. Drucker is referencing here his theory of the collapse of knowledge and perception that occurs when looking at a digital photograph. Drucker, like Batchen, proposes that the digital images are disconnected from truth or resemblance, and that the creative process of making a digital photograph is more like that of a painting. Even though we may recognize the content of the digital image